Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in this current era of reboots, relaunches, reimaginings of iconic franchises, it's easy to get burned out. Now I freely admit the glut of nostalgia bait coming from movies, TVs, and comics has been overwhelming at times, if not frustrating, because there are just some franchises that don't need to be revised. No matter how nostalgic you might be for certain characters or stories, any effort to reboot them would simply devalue them on some level. But, in my opinion, a franchise like Witchblade is not one of those franchises. I would argue that it, more than most, was badly in need of a reboot. The concept, the characters, and the story of this world is ripe for a major revitalization. And recently, Top Cow and Image Comics dared to take that chance within a crowded comic book market. On July 17th, 2024, the first issue of an all-new, all-different Witchblade was released. This is a full, unambiguous reboot, devoid of any baggage from the previous comics. So for anyone unfamiliar with what the Witchblade is, who Sarah Pazini is, and why their story matters, this is the perfect time to get acquainted. And I'm making this video to argue that this is one reboot that is worth embracing. But before I get into the substance of this new series, it's worth revisiting the history of Witchblade as well as its place in comic book history. Because a big part of why Witchblade succeeded as much as it did were the circumstances of its creation. You see, in the early to mid-1990s, the comic book industry was rocked by a number of major shakeups. Now this may have been the heyday of the big two publishers, Marvel and DC Comics, but a number of prominent creators had grown dissatisfied with the massive grip these two companies had on the industry. Historically, Marvel and DC have always exercised a great deal of control over the characters and concepts created by writers and artists. And even before the rise of superhero movies at the box office, the overly corporate nature of these companies ensured that creatives would never retain full control over their creations. So, in 1992, some of the most well-known artists and writers from Marvel and DC got together to start their own company, Image Comics. And their mission was simple: create a comic book company for which creatives could retain control over their creations. In addition, Image Comics would not be bound by the same restrictions or editorial interference. Characters, concepts, and plots deemed too mature for Marvel or DC would be welcome. And that kind of creative freedom is what allowed franchises like Spawn, Jupiter's Legacy, Kick-Ass, and The Walking Dead to blossom. And in the mid-90s, Witchblade was among those franchises that helped Image Comics stand out. Through a creative team that included Mark Silverstreet, Michael Turner, and David Wall, this series gave us a unique blend of superhero fantasy, crime drama, mystery, action-adventure, and supernatural thriller. Combine that with a more mature tone and the undeniable sex appeal of its main protagonist, Sarah Pazini, and Witchblade quickly cemented itself as one of Image Comics' best franchises. With or without the lens of 90s nostalgia, it's hard to overstate how groundbreaking Witchblade was. This series built a world with a complex web of supernatural forces, artifacts, creatures, and lore. The Witchblade was just one such artifact. Born from the darkness and the Angelus, two opposing forces embodying good and evil, the Witchblade functions as a sentient weapon. And through its users, it's tasked with maintaining balance. As for the nature of its users, they're almost always women. Yes, at some points men have attempted to wield this weapon. That's actually a recurring conflict throughout this series, men attempting to wield the Witchblade, often against its will. But it's through the character of Sarah Pazini that we watch, learn, and explore what this weapon can do, as well as why it's so critical to maintaining the balance between light and darkness. Alongside the Witchblade itself, Sarah is the main driving force of this series. She's also a big part of this series' overall success. For one, she's objectively beautiful by every standard of a female comic book character. Her sex appeal was front and center in the very first issue, and through artists like Michael Turner, it remained prominent throughout the series. Now you can read whatever politics or ideology you want into Sarah Pazini's sex appeal. And it's true, her looks did plenty to attract the interest of readers, especially the young male demographic on which much of the industry is built. And the Witchblade's tendency to tear up the clothes of whoever wields it did plenty more to supplement those visuals. But make no mistake, the success of Witchblade was not purely because of how Sarah Pazini looks. Even before she wielded the Witchblade, she carried herself with a personality and presence that really stood out. She's the daughter of a New York City cop, and she talks, spits, drinks, swears, and punches like you'd expect of a woman who grew up in New York City. Sarah is a fighter through and through. She's also impulsive and hot-headed. She has no filter, and she's not known for being sweet and sentimental, even among her friends. But she's not one of those entitled, arrogant know-it-alls who tend to play characters with an attitude. especially when they're female. There actually was a concerted effort to make Sarah more well-rounded. And that was not easy, even back in the 90s. Sarah Pazini could have easily fallen into the many traps that tend to snare female characters in general. But even by today's standards, Sarah achieved a remarkable balance as her story unfolded. From the role she plays in her first encounter with Kenneth Irons and Ian Nottingham, to how she first comes into contact with the Witchblade, to how she handles herself when she starts taking on cases with a supernatural element to them, she's actually allowed to grow, mature, and even fail at times. Even when she has to fight demons, angels, monsters, and psychopaths delving into mystic forces, she always comes off as a tough, capable woman trying to be a good cop. There may still be times when wielding the Witchblade is a heavy burden, and on more than one occasion, she tries to get rid of it. But it always finds its way back to her, usually when she needs it as much as it needs her. Over the years, Sarah and the Witchblade story takes plenty of turns. The series began in 1995 and continued in various forms until the mid-2010s. I could probably make multiple videos about the various stories that came from certain eras, but I'll try to keep the scope here limited because over that span, the quality of the comics fluctuated a great deal. It certainly started strong and stayed strong throughout the late 90s, but by the late 2000s, fluctuating creative teams and increasingly bland stories had diminished Witchblade's relevance. It eventually got to a point where nobody seemed to know what to do with this franchise. By the time it ended, there was no series finale or climactic battle, and Sarah's story and that of the Witchblade just stopped. It was as unsatisfying as it was unceremonious. Now, there was an attempt to reboot Witchblade in 2017, but that endeavor was doomed to fail from the beginning, largely because it tried to relaunch without Sarah Pazini being front and center. It had also tried way too hard to avoid the familiar visuals and lore of Witchblade, and yes, that included the sex appeal. Looking back on that effort, I don't think anyone at Image had a true vision for an updated take on Witchblade. But this latest reboot feels very different. With a creative team that includes Margaret Bennett, Giuseppe Cafaro, and Eric Printo, this new take on Witchblade has a more coherent vision behind it. It also doesn't go out of its way to distance itself from the tone, aesthetics, and style of its predecessor. Granted, it doesn't lean as much into the sex appeal as the comics of the mid-90s, but it really doesn't have to in order to work here. In the very first issue, we meet Sarah Pazini as she's dealing with the harsh realities of being a New York City cop. We also meet familiar characters who are destined to oppose her, like Kenneth Irons and Ian Nottingham. There's still a lot of lore surrounding the Witchblade that hasn't been touched on. We only know from the first issue that it's a sentient weapon that seeks a female wielder. Sarah isn't actively seeking that role, nor is she eager to embrace it, but she quickly finds herself in a dire situation, one in which she needs the Witchblade to survive. The tone is considerably darker and much more serious when compared to past Witchblade comics, but I think that's both appropriate and necessary for the story to work. Because being a cop, as well as a female character in 2024, has different expectations than it did in 1995. It's just not enough for Sarah to be her hardened, badass self while wielding an ancient weapon. The setting around her must match with how the world has evolved since the 90s. And I think that's the key. I also think that's what will help this reboot succeed. We no longer live in an environment where cops are assumed to be the good guys. The general public, including comic book fans, are much more knowledgeable of corruption, police brutality, and the flaws of the justice system. There's just too much documentation of police acting like the bad guys for certain tropes to work. In this context, Sarah Pazini being a good cop takes on a very different meaning. At the same time, the first issue indicates that she's also spent time in the military, and some of the things she experienced were difficult, if not traumatic. These are not mere contrivances for the sake of the plot. This sort of thing actually manifests in the real world, and people today are much more aware of it than they were in the 90s. Add a supernatural twist to the mix, further complicating Sarah's struggles just to be a good cop, and this new vision of Witchblade has a strong foundation to build on. Being a cop already made her a target. Being the wielder of the Witchblade only makes her a bigger target to even worse threats. How she navigates this alongside her many personal issues, that has the potential to be a remarkable story. Her fighting monsters while looking awesome in Witchblade-style armor, that's just a bonus. Now, I certainly don't deny that Witchblade has an uphill battle in terms of gaining relevance. The comic book industry has changed a great deal since the mid-1990s. To succeed in an era of superhero movies and corporate-backed IP requires much more than a great creative team and incredible visuals. But even if this new Witchblade series is unable to achieve the same relevance it had in decades past, I still believe that this reboot is taking the right approach. In just one issue, Witchblade #1 reintroduce Sarah Pazini and her world to a new generation. Hopefully, this world will continue to evolve and blossom. Where it goes and what this means for the future of Image Comics, only time will tell. But I still believe that the time is right for Witchblade to reassert itself in the comic book world. It really left an indelible mark on the industry at a time when it needed a major shakeup. And regardless of whether or not it does the same thing this time around, I'm still rooting for it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.